The B78 Coaching Podcast takes a quick dive into the lives of athletes at all levels. Short and sweet, the goal is to help you troubleshoot some of the common issues and questions around training in a time-efficient manner. Welcome to the B78 Coaching Podcast. Joining us today is Adam Gant from about 30,000 feet, although you said it's more like 12,000 feet in the background.
Well, when we do these Zoom calls now because of the COVID lockdown, we got to make sure we've got an inspiring background while we're cooped up in our homes. So
I love it.
This was a good one to put in behind.
You're very tech savvy. I've tried to do that on my Zoom and it looks terrible. It's sort of, my head is always in the picture itself, or like the picture is like
otherwise it can't
face.
Keep up.
Yeah. It's pretty, well, anyway, you look great. You look like you're just poised for a great conversation.
Well, it's awesome. Sunrise. It's early in the morning. It's a good way to start the day out.
It's very nice. I know you, Adam, as probably one of the toughest dudes I've ever met. You are never shy to a big challenge, and I know you've done lots of incredible stuff, including mountaineering, getting to the top of some really cool peaks. Last year, or in September, I think you did a 100K ultra run.
Yeah, the Finlayson arm race actually. And part of the inspiration for that was the trail itself. It's such a beautiful spot. It's really enjoyable to be up there on that course. So it was just, even the training, I did a lot of training on that course. It was just such a good time to be up there in with the view of the Finlayson arm there in the ocean and view it over the city and the islands and Olympic Mountains, was just great.
It really is pretty spectacular. And that course in particular, I have a rough idea of where the route goes, and I've certainly run pieces of it over the years, and it's remarkable. I mean, it's so beautiful. Now, what got you in? I mean, you are not the typical ultra runner in my mind. You're a rower. That's your history.
Yeah, actually, that race confirmed that for me.
Yeah, I mean, you're not a small individual. How much do you weigh? Not that we like getting into weight, but how much do you weigh?
Well, I did the race. I was about 240 for that race. So I don't know if there's another person that was over 200 pounds. I mean, people that are doing that are, definitely the gazelles, not the not the gorillas.
Totally. I mean, when you got to, carry that around for that length of time, and just to be clear, you're 240 pounds of jacked muscle. You come from a rowing background, you stay super fit, and but that's a lot of muscle to carry around for that length of time. How long did it take you?
Well, I was about 23 and a half hours. So it was good long run for that distance. I think a lot of it was the course is not like running on a flat trail. There's a lot of the course which is almost a scramble. So you're going up over Mount Finlayson or over up Mount Work, and a lot of that is not just jogging down a trail. It's scrambling over rocks, and so it's slower moving, especially with the elevation gain on that, because it was 105 kilometers and 20,000 feet of elevation gain, which is a pretty decent amount of gain for that length of course. I think there's roughly that amount of elevation gain, or actually no, slightly more than that for the big one in Switzerland, but it's almost 75% longer. So it's, there's a good amount of elevation gain for that distance, which makes it a little bit slower. But that being said, it was a great, great experience.
That is amazing. And you said about 23 and a half hours. Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
So did you know as you're getting close that you were, you could break the 24-hour barrier? Was that sort of on your mind, or did you care?
I don't know if that was so much. Actually, one of the things that was interesting is there was a guy that I happened to just connect with about 4 hours in, and I never met the guy before, but just started chatting and realized that there was something about the mental aspect of it, that there was a big benefit to being able to chat with somebody as you went on the course. So most people are just going on it alone. So we made the point of just deciding to kind of pace and stay side by side effectively for the rest of the race. So he was definitely faster on the flat, and I was faster on the uphill because I was a pretty good strong power hike. But by doing that and just being able to chat, it kind of takes your mind off the enduring part of it and the length of it. And that actually made the experience much better. It helped take the mind off some of the soreness and whatever's happening in your knees or muscles. And so that, arguably probably slowed us both down. Maybe both of us would have finished faster if we didn't do it that way. I took a little bit more time at the aid stations, but in the end, it like there was no way I wasn't finishing that. That made it so much easier to finish because it was so much more comfortable the whole time.
Yeah, yeah. That like, I don't know if it's misery likes company or whether you just have something to take your mind off of what you're actually doing. That was probably helpful.
Well, there was something fascinating that happened. And I think part of the reason why I even tried to do this race was when we all started listening to David Goggins and his audiobook and talking about going out there and just looking for ways to punish ourselves. But he mentions this idea called his cookie jar technique, which is in his metaphor was he would remember back to when he was a kid and his mom would stock up this cookie jar, but she'd only let them eat from it on special occasions. So metaphorically, taking a cookie from the cookie jar was always a special moment. It was always to celebrate something that had happened that was positive. So then he started thinking about how he could stock up his own memory bank of these cookie jar moments, which were some of the successes, the wins, the victories that he'd had in his lifetime. And so whenever he was competing or whenever he was in that moment of pain and suffering, he would think back to a cookie jar memory. And so I thought, well, that's kind of a neat way of doing it. So I went back and I kind of wrote some notes out over the last year prior to the race of different memories that I had growing up. Some of them were with my dad going hiking in Yoho National Park in the Rockies. Some of them were doing, like a rowing event that was a successful outcome, or other sporting events or other just general happy events. And there was maybe 3 or 4 of them that were probably the most vivid. But the list of them after repeating this and turning into a habit while training, all throughout the race, whenever it started to get tough, or whenever there's a moment where it's uncomfortable, just these cookie jar memories started coming up for me. And so I was no longer running the race. I was no longer living on the trail and stomping it out minute after minute. I was just reliving these cookie jar memories. And it was like an endorphin rush. It was like this just sensation high for 80% of that whole run. So like, in other words, 80% of the run, I wasn't even on the course. I was just in my mind, reliving these great memories. And so the time just flew by, like the 23 and a half hours. I couldn't tell you it felt like 23 and a half hours. Maybe it felt like 2 or 3 hours. And the rest of the time I was just in this imagined place. So that technique for endurance runs, I would say, or for endurance sports of any kind, I'd say is hugely powerful.
That is just such an awesome insight. I feel like I've done that in a way, but I have never done it as deliberately as it sounds like you did. Like you had a real mental strategy for this thing. And it sounds like you trained, like in training, you would incorporate that as part of your strategy as a way to mentally not only handle it, but as a way to mentally cue yourself in the tough moments. Is that right?
Well, totally. And because the training that I was doing my goal in training was to get as close as I could to actually running the event, because I just wasn't sure I could do it. Especially mainly the part about running overnight, because it started at 5 p.m. and you run all through the night and then through to the next day. And I'd never done anything like that before. So I would started training through the nighttime. And in the nighttime, I think it's natural for most people, when you can't see things and you hear noises and you're in that adrenaline boosted state already, you're pretty short on nerves. So that strategy worked really well, and it used it in training, and therefore it was already a habit by the time I came to run the race.
That is just so cool. I love that. I'm going to steal that.
Well, you must have had, so like for me, because it was about finishing more than anything else, like I thought that I was going to have a decent time, but I never believed that I could come close to winning, because I saw the last year's record, and the guys that were running it were definitely the genetic type of person to win that race. But for you, in some of the races that you've done, and obviously winning in the Ironman championship, or so the Ironman race, you must have had a certain thing that you're focusing on to not just compete it and compete in it and complete it, but actually win and stay ahead of everybody else. So there must have been something that you were visualizing that was like that as well.
Yeah, for sure. One of my best strategies, I think, for those longer ones was just the ability to stay present. Like I really tried to develop that as a mental skill as much as anything, because I found I could always handle those smaller moments. Like, and if you're present, you're basically just only really having to manage that moment.
Yeah.
And anytime I would get in the past or kind of wish for the finish line or wish for something different than where I currently was, then this is not good either. So I really practiced in the training the mental ability to stay right in myself, like right where I was, and to really embrace the exact moment I was in. And that became a real strength. I mean, that was a practice that I took outside of training and racing as well.
So
And
were you, would you, like, so in that moment, were you looking at, say, heart rate or cadence on the bike or speed, and just like edging it up a little bit more, or like what was the moment like then if you're focused in the present?
yeah, so I'd always give myself something to do. So exactly what you said, I'd be, concentrating on the metrics. So if I had a heart rate range I'm supposed to be in, or a cadence range, or whatever the metrics were that I'd practiced and I wanted to stay on task with, that was one thing. Nutrition's another thing, because, I'd be, into my nutrition every 5-10 minutes. So it, gave manageable chunks in between those nutrition breaks.
Yeah.
Um, but it was also, I think, something a little bit deeper than that for me, which was just to kind of observe and pay attention to where I was physically, mentally, emotionally in those moments. Even if it was a tough moment, I would just learn to observe it and sort of see it and just be like, oh, that's interesting.
Hmm.
And the instant that I try and wish to be in some other time or space, like not doing what I was doing, I'd just pull
Yeah.
myself back and I'd be like, hey, you know what? I'm really, struggling right now, but that's okay. Let's just hang out here. Let's struggle for a bit. Let's
Hmm.
like, let's embrace this exact moment for whatever it's giving me, whether it's, I'm in a euphoric part of the journey or a tough part of the journey. I just really try and lean into whatever space I was in. And as I said, that, like, I was really trying to do that in my own personal life as well. It wasn't just a strategy for racing. I was sort of embracing that whole idea, and I still do to this day. I found it's a real practice. You have to keep practicing it. You can't just sort of achieve a state like that and exist there forever. I think you're always having to go back and practice it.
So did you notice that you would become more relaxed when you were had that focus? And in other words, maybe your heart rate would come down a little bit, or in some cases, you found that your heart rate was too low and you tried to push it up again by increasing the intensity. Like, was that an aspect of it?
Yeah, I definitely, relaxed is a great word, because I found I was just more at peace with wherever I was at, and thereby you become a little bit more relaxed in that space.
Hmm.
So yeah, it was. I mean, in the times that I had really powerful moments like that in races where I was really able to tap into that, the races usually went well.
Yeah.
And I think it was just because I would be so focused on each moment. So each moment I was getting the most out of each moment.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was, it wasn't the exact same strategy, but I did, back to your original question about, did I have little cues to sort of inspire me? Well, because it sounds like you did that too, right? You had your cookie jar
Yes.
of
Yeah.
moments that you could kind of reach for mentally, and then just hang out there, so you'd almost forget about where you were at. And so, being present maybe is a little bit different than that, but I also had those. So in the low moments, I would tap into things like, uh you know maybe feelings I wanted to have at the finish, like how I knew how good it would feel. So I needed that little carrot, because
Yeah.
if I just keep going like this, things are going to be really good at the end of the day. And so that would give me a little rush. Um, so that's maybe something similar. But as I said, I really like that idea of having a mental cookie jar that you're able to pull from and be like, okay, you know what? Things are tough right now. I'm going to go to my mental cookie jar. And this is like, I'm in a moment now that I can hang out for a bit, and it'll get me through this tough part. That's
Yeah. Funny
cool.
thing, I don't know if you've heard of this. There's this victory posture. So people put up their hands in the air like in a V, and maybe naturally it makes you open up your chest a little bit more, breathe a little bit more, and maybe stand up a little straighter. And so that gives you an endorphin rush. Maybe that's as simple as that. But I've heard that there's some sort of evolutionary thing with human beings celebrating by putting their hands up in the air. So anyway, the cookie jar memories, what I found was interesting is that when I was focused on something that was a great experience, I'd actually stand up a little bit straighter, and the running form would actually improve, and I would relax a little bit more. I'd be breathing fully. And so it actually started to both dull the pain, but also improve the performance. I'd actually be able to speed up a bit. And so it was interesting, that combination of just mentally, it took away the discomfort and also actually improved the physical form of the running and the speed. So that was just kind of a neat experience.
That is so cool. I have read about that and about victory pose, and almost it sort of, it reminds me of Stuart Smalley a little bit. Like when you look in the mirror and you're like, gosh darn it, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and
Yeah.
people like you. And I know it's not quite like that, but I think it's the same kind of idea where you put yourself physically into a position, even if it's like smiling. Like they say that
Right.
if you
Yeah.
almost force a smile, you can't help but bring your energy up. And that victory pose, I forget where I read that, but I was like, that's a funny one. And I did try it for a few days. Like if I ever felt kind of low, I just put my arms up in the air like I'd won something.
Yeah.
And
But
it kind of helped. Like you couldn't help but sort of feel a little bit more engaged and whatever.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting to compare to the opposite, which is what happens when you're in a state of suffering and that's all you can focus on. So, and I had plenty of those times training where it just felt terrible and something was hurting or some muscle was pulled, and to keep going meant that pain was just lighting up, and that nerve line was just lighting up over and over and over again. And then the mind would tend to think about that, and then you'd want to try to get, release the pressure on that, release the tension on that, so that it didn't feel as painful.
Mm-hmm.
And then you slow down, and then maybe you get kind of embarrassed by not being able to perform your best, and the mind would just keep playing these things out over and over. So then I realized, well, if that's going to happen on that side, and all I can do is just eliminate that focus and relax, and then realizing that pain goes away in a positive way, and still keep up the speed. Well, at the end of the day, that's going to make the performance better. So whatever gets the job done, great. But it certainly also made the experience much more enjoyable too. So.
Yeah, that's cool. And I like you also said that the 23 and a half hours sort of just kind of, you know, not disappeared, but it sounds like mentally it didn't feel like it was that long.
No,
Like you were
not at
just,
all. Yeah,
yeah.
not at all. It was also nice too. The weather was perfect. It was not hot. But it was sunny. And actually, oddly, running through the night was much more enjoyable than running through the middle of the afternoon, because it was a day where the skies were clear, so the stars were out, but it was a nice, cool temperature. So, you didn't get as sweaty, you didn't get as dehydrated. So it made it much more comfortable to keep running for that length of time.
Did you said you started at 5 p.m. I'm neither here nor there. I think if I was a race director and I was doing something that I knew would take that long for people, I don't actually know what time I would start it at. But thinking back, did you like that sort of the first half of that brought you through the night, or would you have preferred to start at 8 a.m.? Or, 5 p.m. start for a race is kind of a weird one in terms of sports. Usually we get up, we
Yeah,
have
usually the
breakfast,
full day
and
first.
away we go. But
It was a Friday, so there's probably a couple of simple reasons for it. If I'm putting myself in their shoes, to do the longer race, they wanted to have it first because it gave people more than enough time into the weekend, and they had another start time the next morning for the half court or the half distance of that amount. So it allowed them to have the Friday night and the Saturday and have all the volunteers basically there for that 24-hour period, and then done. And then, of course, because it's a weekend, it allows people to start on a Friday afternoon, take maybe the day off or take half the day off early, get a bit of rest in. So just starting at 5 p.m. on a Friday makes sense if you want to get as much of the race done before Saturday afternoon as possible. Maybe it could have started at 3, but I actually really liked the fact that the first part of the race wasn't in the hottest part of the day. So the first piece, from 5 to 7 is pretty comfortable. And then after that, throughout the evening, you get used to the nighttime and it's a cool temperature. And then the last part of the race, you're not going to go back into the night again, in this case, because of the length of time for the course. So, but there's lots of ultras that go 2 nights or multiple nights, the really, really long ones. So, in that case, probably doesn't matter when you start if you're going to go multiple days anyway.
yeah, true. That's an interesting perspective. And I guess from, if you're starting if you have multiple start lines with a shorter one that starts the next morning, then that actually makes good sense. And yeah, you're right. Getting the dark part over early is probably favorable for most people. May even be safer. You have a bit more energy. You're a little more with it when you have to do, navigate through the dark. So
Yeah.
So what was I mean, it sounds like mentally you had a great strategy and you executed it well and the mental side went well. Was there anything physically that you found particularly challenging that you struggled with?
I think so nutrition was hugely important. Nutrition was really interesting and again, I've got a bit more of I'd say a math and science background. So certainly tracking things with numbers is easy for me. But the nutrition, I had to realize for my body weight and my size, the amount of calories and the amount of carbohydrates that I had to eat was much more than I would have thought or that I naturally would have eaten in terms of just not having the appetite while racing. So I found that it was much easier to break down the nutrition. And so say, for example, with a Cliff Bar, if I was going to have a Cliff Bar, I wouldn't have a whole Cliff Bar at once. I'd have half a Cliff Bar every half an hour instead of having a whole Cliff Bar once an hour. And then I had a carbohydrate drink and then some other things along the way as well. And I actually found that way of eating. And so I ended up carrying more weight on me because I found that it was much easier to eat consistently throughout the whole race than to only just hit the aid stations and get food at that point. Also, it's slower if you have to stop for length of time at the aid station versus just having something in my pocket that I could pull out and snack on while I was moving. So there's just some little things that I found really made a big difference for me. But more than anything else, the tough parts were I'm just not a very good runner. I don't know if it's just the biomechanics for me. So it took a long time to just get to the point where I was even comfortable running. Like every single running training session I would have always hurt. Like I'd finish off a run, whether it was an hour or 2 or 3 hours, and I'd always be hurting afterwards, whether it's my calves or some part of my body. So just the physical mechanics of running and the technique of running and the muscles being trained for that. So that was probably the most difficult part. And, obviously it's one of those things where we think we've done it since we were 1 year old. So how can there be a technique to it? But the little nuances and the little subtleties that I, slowly improved with over time made a big, big difference. I'm still not a good runner, but that was kind of an interesting aspect to focus on and try to become better at. And I know obviously you're incredible at that. I remember our training run when the first time I went running with you, and your nice leisurely jog is like as fast as I can sprint. So I'm sure there's more I can learn from you with some more training and coaching too.
Well, I think, a couple things. First, I think your nutrition strategy was spot on. I always encourage people to do small amounts frequently. And there's a number of reasons for that. It keeps your blood sugar way more level. There's never too long where you end up with a gap. Same with hydration and sodium levels. So that was spot on. That was definitely the right way to do it. In terms of the running itself, I wouldn't beat yourself up too bad. I think part of it is simply just your size. Like, you and I are very different human beings. I'm literally half your size. Like I am half the man that you are.
I don't know about that. No, I think you're twice the man, but maybe it's you've I don't know. It might be my bone density or something. I way too much for even how tall I am. So,
but the thing, we're just very different. We're the same animal species, but we're just very different sizes. And for me, I'm just smaller, lighter, so I don't have to. The impact load is way less for me. And then, even if you take someone my size, the best like marathon runners in the world are basically my height, so they're about 5'5", but I outweigh them by almost 30 pounds.
Wow,
that might be a bit extreme.
You're actually a bit heavy then.
I am. No, I'm not kidding. I'm about 135, 140 pounds, and some of those guys are probably 110, 105, 110 pounds. And if you put us side by side, you'd think I look like quite enormous, like just kind of muscular and big. And we probably have similar VO2 maxes, like me and those runners when I was super fit.
Yeah.
But they're doing it with 20, 30 pounds less.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the impact load, like they would also be able to handle way more in training for sure. Like their training volume probably be quite a bit higher. So, that is, them to me is not much difference from me to you. And so for you to take on a challenge that is 23 hours on your legs with that size of a body is just remarkable. And so I wouldn't beat yourself up too much. And by that, I mean, yes, technically for sure, there's some changes that we can all make that will help. But the reality for you is that you're up against just a body size issue where you have just much more to carry. So the impact load is much higher. It's just a more challenging. Whereas if you put us both on a bike on flat terrain, I mean, you would, over 23 hours, you'd probably absolutely crush me, because it's about absolute. Like you're just a bigger engine, and there's not as much impact load. So
I wouldn't think that'd be a case even on a bike, on flats. Like maybe if it was really steep downhill, so that my weight really helped.
well,
And
no, because in it's the same. Well, actually, you're a rower, so rower is an even better example because they have weight classes, right? And
yeah,
the reason for that is because bigger engine is just it's non-weight bearing, so it's all about the size of the engine.
yeah,
And when you're rowing, you can't, somebody like my size just can't physically compete with somebody your size. You're just bigger levers, bigger engine, bigger lung capacity. Your absolute power, your absolute VO2 max is just going to be higher anyway. But if you had to row uphill, that might be different.
right. Well, and so there's, I was going to add one thing, but speaking of uphill, I mean, that was the other thing that I wanted to bring up and get your thoughts on it. The one thing I was going to add is that it reminds me of this photo in the Richmond Oval, the Olympic Oval in Vancouver. And there's a picture, and it's a bunch of different, like probably 30 or 40 different elite athletes of different sports. And it shows them with their shirt off or with their whatever uniform or suit that they would be competing in. And it shows sumo wrestlers and football players and jousters or fencing champions and people doing high jump and sprinters and marathon runners. So it's got the whole gamut of different sports, but you can see the body types lined up of who would be the most elite person in that category. And what's interesting when you look at that picture is that there is a sport for everybody. And so sometimes, and this is something that I even think about with my kids, is that sometimes the first sport you try is maybe not the one that you're genetically, biomechanically predestined to be the champion at. But if there's some other sports that you can try, sometimes we like the sports that we're good at. And if we can win in a sport, it feels so much better to train and to really become great at it. So, just a point there is there are all sorts of different sports that different body types are great at.
I've seen that poster. I think it's wonderful. I really
Yeah.
like that. And I think there was Time Magazine or somebody did a big spread before one of the Olympic Games to the same effect, where they just kind of profiled a whole bunch of athletes from different sports just to show how different different sports are and different body types that are successful in different sports. I thought that was great.
Yeah, it's inspiring. I mean, because I think the idea that there's hope that everybody could have a sport where they could excel at is a very inspiring idea.
Yeah, and I think that's, I know you're not into triathlon, but I think that's actually one of the main appeals of triathlon is that there's 3 different sports,
Right.
and you don't have to be particularly great at either one of them, but everybody kind of shines in one of them. So, if you're smaller like me, running was my thing. So I would, at the end of the race, that's where I'd make up my time. But, somebody like you could get in there and, maybe you got a swimming background, so you're crushing it out of the water and really solid on the bike, and then the run's tough for you. So in triathlon, everybody kind of has, or people usually have somewhere where they shine a little bit.
Yeah.
And that, that kind of keeps them going and keeps them motivated and feeling good. So
I think if I trained, swimming might be the one that I would be stronger at. It's too bad that it's only like 1/6 or 1/8 of the total time of the course. So
that's true, actually. Yeah, the swimmers get a pretty raw deal in triathlon.
Well, so your other point about uphill, I thought is interesting, because the reason that I got into the ultra marathon is that I had my sights set on climbing some of the taller mountains around the world over time. And so the last few years I've just been going on a tear and trying to climb as many different mountains locally as I could to get some experience. And then I thought, well, if I could do one of these ultra marathons, and that would be a good bit of proof that I've got the endurance for what it would take to go into higher altitude and to deal with the longer multi-day expeditions. And so I was curious to get your thoughts on energy systems and dealing with oxygen deprivation at higher altitudes. There's an interesting story that I can share later too, if we've got time, but just about one of the guides that I went with on one of the climbs in the Bugaboos. But I was curious to hear your thoughts about, just because oxygen deprivation is something where we can train at altitude, but I've heard that within something like 6 days, the adaptation to the lower oxygen environment goes away. So it seems like it's more about just general fitness and generally having a higher level of fitness versus trying to specifically adapt for higher altitude.
Well, I think, we're getting into territory that I know reasonably well, maybe not like very, very well compared to, experts who specialize in that. What I will say is that, there definitely is. I mean, obviously when you go to altitude and adapt, that's one of the most important things. And that's why, people climb Everest, they spend like a couple months at base camp, not only scoping the route and maybe waiting for the right days, but they just have to acclimate.
Yeah.
So, that is probably the single most important thing that people can do there. I don't think you can circumnavigate the altitude adaptation by doing something else and expecting the same result. Like, you have to go to altitude and you have to be there and live in it, especially if you're going to do some of these really high climbs. Like, I think it would be incredibly negligent to just sort of arrive at base camp with a helicopter and then power your way up there. Nobody.
Actually, people have done it. Although, well, shouldn't say that. We don't know how long they got used to the base camp altitude, which is higher than most of the mountains in North America.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah, for sure. And actually, we did that trek with my mom back in 2007.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Yeah, we took her to base camp, and I think base camp's at about 5,600 meters or something, which is higher than the tallest peak in Canada. Is it Mount Logan in Canada? This one.
I think, I don't know. I can't remember what Logan is. I want to say is it 19,000 feet or 16,000 feet?
It's about 18. I think it's 18. Anyway, base camp is about the same as that.
Yeah.
And I remember when we got above 5,000 meters. So what's that in feet? 16,000 feet or something.
16, yeah.
Yeah. So when we got above 5,000 meters, I found that's when I struggled the most.
Yeah.
Like, I really started to notice it. Up until that point, I actually was fine. I mean, maybe your heart rate comes up a bit and you feel a little more winded, but it was when we got above 5,000 meters, I found sleeping really difficult, and you'd wake up and it was just, you always felt
you don't feel rested. Yeah.
Yeah. And we only spent, I think, 3 days over 5,000 for sure. We probably spent 3 days around 5,500 or 5,600 meters. And those were tough days for sure. So anyway, back to your question. Like, I think, the single best way to get ready for altitude is probably to go to altitude. And then, I think you said the effects only last 6 days. Now I'm guessing that means if you
come
go
down
and come down.
Come down. Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard, I don't know the exact answer to that one. I think it might be a little bit longer than that because it's probably red blood cell lifespan.
Yeah.
You go up there, your body is triggered to produce more.
Yeah.
And that's how you transport more oxygen. And so I think it maybe is lasting a little bit longer than 6 days. When we used to use altitude as a way to get ready for events, we would either time it, we would either go to altitude and then come and compete right away, or we would actually
a couple of days, or how fast after?
Like within a day or two, or you would. Some people did well with that protocol, and some people did well by actually waiting a couple of weeks. So
really?
Interesting. Time it to come down. And there may be new science on it. I don't feel well versed enough to give a definite answer on that. I think it might be partly individual.
I always noticed, like last summer when I was doing some of the mountains, which weren't very high, 10,000 feet or so, but it was enough where the body would have to adapt somewhat. And then if I was doing a training run a week after, it would just feel amazing like that. I found kind of that 5 to 6, 7 day window where whatever training run I normally would have done that day, compared to what I would have done before coming off the mountain, I just felt like I had unlimited energy. There's no lactic acid buildup. It just felt like I could just keep going.
Yeah. That's really cool. And so, there you've probably kind of discovered your sweet spot, 5 or 6 days after, for sure.
Enough time to recover, but not enough for the adaptation to go away, kind of what.
Yeah. And as I said, I think it definitely lasts longer than 5 or 6 days. I think it's the life cycle of a red blood cell, probably more accurate, which I've heard is up to 30 days. But again,
really interesting.
Yeah, but again, I don't want to give false information. I think after this, I need to do a fact check.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I get it's kind of an interesting conundrum because if we can't easily adapt to altitude without being at altitude, but we don't live at altitude, or depending on where we live in the world, but a lot of us don't live at altitude. And so then the question is, well, how can we train? Because I've also heard that once you get to altitude, depending on what we're talking about, like Everest Base Camp or above, then you actually start to your physical fitness can start to deteriorate because you're not recovering from whatever exertion that you're under. And so it's not like you can stay at altitude to train for altitude. You actually have to be down away from altitude to train and actually get stronger and fitter. So it's kind of an interesting paradox there, where how do you train for something that's actually going to make you weaker once you get there, but you need to be there to acclimatize to the altitude?
Yeah, well, I can tell you how they did that in sport for many years, which was sleep high, train low. So they would, you'd either altitude tents were a big thing back in the day, or you'd go live somewhere where that was a possibility. So I know in, getting ready for Hawaii Ironman, like you can very quickly get up to altitude because it's all the volcanoes there. You can, on Maui, you can be, on Maui, you can be at 10,000 feet in a 40K bike ride. Like there's a road that goes right up there. So sometimes they would utilize strategies like that where you're sleeping up there and then coming down to sea level to train.
Yeah.
Because you're right. Fitness wise at sea level, you can just produce more. You can go faster at sea level. And if let's say you're a 400 meter runner, 800 meter runner, whatever, you need to train muscle specificity to go a certain speed. It's no good going to 10,000 feet and now you're doing your 400 meter reps 5 seconds slower. You're not training muscularly the same way. So that was the philosophy back then but there's, how many places in the world can you sleep at, 8,000 or 9,000 feet and be down at sea level in a half-hour drive? There's not a lot.
Right. Very few.
Very few.
Yeah, very, very few.
Yeah. But I would say, but you're right, okay, you go to Everest Base Camp, you spend, however, I don't know, 8, 12 weeks. I don't know how long they spend there before they start climbing, but you're right. You would lose some fitness. But I would argue that the altitude acclimation is far more important than losing a little bit of fitness. And I don't mean you go from like fit enough to climb it to like, I can't get off the couch, because I don't think that's what happens. But if your body's not ready for that really high altitude, that's when you get into real trouble.
And the way that they acclimatize is by going up and down between the different camps. So they're getting some fitness, but even that, I'm guessing, is starting to atrophy their muscles as they're burning away some of the protein for energy going up and down constantly.
Yeah, it's just there's an overall stress load that's far greater up there than it is down at sea level just by existing. You don't even have to be working out, just existing is harder.
Well, that brings up the last thing I was going to ask you, which is this idea of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, so the fight or flight response. And one of the things that I was finding, which is a real challenge last summer, not so much during the long ultramarathon, but more on the mountain climbs. But then what I found is that every time I do a longer run, the first 45 minutes or so, my heart would start to race like uncontrollably fast. But then when I got warmed up enough and I started to calm down, almost like I used up the adrenaline or whatever was making the heart race, then I would hit this nice, steady pace. But it started when I was going up the mountains, and I'd start out going up the approach trail quickly, and I would hit kind of a lactic acid threshold too fast, and then the heart rate would start to accelerate. And one climb in particular, which was the Forbidden Peak climb, there was a point where we got to, and it was starting to get cold, and we were exposed, and I was probably near peak heart rate for 3 or 4 hours. Like I was just draining the all reserves at that point. But what I was going to ask you is if you've ever found that in whether it was a hill during a long bike race or something where your heart rate sped up, or you wanted to either control it and moderate but make it go faster so you could get up that hill, or calm yourself down, and whether you got into kind of managing that more closely?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I can't, usually heart rate has a lag time. Usually heart rate's a little bit slow to quick pick up. Now I'm not talking like it takes half an hour. Like I'm talking like a minute or two to catch up to the load. That sounds more to me like, I don't know the exact situations this was happening, but it sounds like to me more like an adrenaline response, or maybe you had some kind of, if you had too many cups of coffee or a Red Bull or something that kind of just elevated that part of your system. rather than or you just going out too hard. Like it
Right.
could be
Yeah.
that as well. You could be just excited, and kind of that burst of adrenaline's got you going like harder than you should initially.
Well, I was reading on it, and there's something about this vagus nerve, that runs down over the top of the rib cage, or just on the edge of the abdominal muscles on both sides, and something about that you can actually, like, it can be tense, or it can be turned on, and then basically it's part of the fight or flight response. But while that's turned on, your body will not come back out of the sympathetic state. So the only way to do that is to actually manually release that muscle, or that nerve. Just like trying to breathe more deeply, or relax, or stick your finger underneath your rib cage and try to get it to let go. But I just was reading that the body doesn't normally come down out of the sympathetic state without something happening, something physically happening. So like lying down and going to sleep or something like that. So it was almost like the body was just triggered into this sympathetic state and just wouldn't come out normally, which was kind of a weird experience. But I don't know, it was maybe a combination of fear of heights and then obviously the physical stress.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's just a fascinating situation, and I'd be I'd be feeding you some BS if I was like, oh, that's that, and this is what you do. Like, I'm curious to go read about it after, and especially just physically manipulating that area to bring it down.
And it makes me think, if we can kind of get into that place where it's firing too much, maybe there's times when we're not firing enough, and it'd be nice to be able to kind of turn it on a little bit more to get us through a tough section, or a hilly section, or whatever it might be, but then not have to use it too much where you get worn out, or you get exhausted.
Yeah, I think that would exhaust you. And you're touching on something that is maybe very relevant for people who get really anxious before races. Like,
Yeah.
maybe that actually becomes part of the, when people have a panic attack before a race or
Totally.
something, like
Yeah.
maybe that's what's being triggered. And from, just the nerves and the anxiety of the whole situation. Like, people often with triathlon can have an anxiety response when they head into the water with 1,000 other people. That can be a really tough space.
Like drowning or just swallowing water. Yeah, it would feel terrible.
Totally. And maybe that's what's happening. So I think what you're touching on is the ability to actually control that. So, okay, I don't want that happening right now, versus, oh, I need a little bit more of that. I mean, we're talking like next level enlightenment sort of, like practice. It sounds fascinating to me. I would love to be able to control that.
Well, the one experience on the Forbidden Peak was terrifying. There was nothing unsafe. It was just that feeling of that fight or flight constantly. And then the next experience a few weeks later, after I'd done a little bit of reading, the whole point was I just tried to never breathe fast, which is, you can't really do that if you're doing a triathlon or a marathon. You're going to start breathing pretty well. But by keeping the breathing rate at a slower and consistent speed, I never hit that fight or flight state. So I was just calm the whole time, and my heart rate never accelerated like that. But during the ultra marathon, about 40 minutes in, about 35 minutes in, I tried to pace it out of the start and just jog nicely and let people kind of zoom ahead if they had their own race plan. And lo and behold, 30 minutes in, I hit this point where my heart rate started feeling like it was hitting like 190, 200 for no reason. So I had to stop myself and stand still for 2 minutes before the heart rate would come back down. And I had to end up doing that twice. But then about 45 minutes in, never happened again. It was fine for the rest of the race. So it was like getting over that initial little jolt of, like, you picture like a race car, and you hit the the NOx's button, and you get this nitrogen boost into the engine. It's like, okay, well, that runs its course. And then you're kind of running back on regular gasoline again. And that's kind of what it felt like. But the interesting thing was that I couldn't stop it from happening. Like, it was almost like it became a habit. It would happen every time I go out for a long run, half an hour, 45 minutes in. So, it's interesting. I haven't had it happen since, but it is kind of an interesting aspect to try to figure out how to master.
Yeah, that would be a very, I think, good and important thing to master. It sounds like you get to the point where you just exhausted that part of your system.
Yeah, I think that's what it was, because it just runs down like, okay, we can't do that anymore. So just, we give up.
Yeah, I feel like it must be tied to an adrenal response, because I think adrenaline is what usually does that, like kind of sends us into that mode. It's, we release that when we have a fear or something where we need to have like more strength than we usually do. So it might be
Yeah, it
tied to
must
that,
be.
but
Yeah,
I
it must
want
be.
to, can you please send me the article you were talking about, how you can, like just physically working that out?
Yeah,
I'd love to read it.
I'll see if I can find it. There was a couple of YouTube videos where people are talking about, like, I just searched parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system on YouTube, but I'll see if I can find some links and, as a follow up.
That would be great. Yeah. Um, buddy, this has been great. Thank you. I learned a bunch of stuff today, or it's at least made me far more curious about a few things. And what's up next for you? Have you got some mountains planned? I mean, obviously we're in a bizarre time right now, so
Yeah, we are. Well, I'm looking forward to. So there's a mountain on Vancouver Island, and actually, I'll say this because I think it might be great for anybody that's listening to this down the road, or anybody that lives in Vancouver Island. There's two places that I think are the most beautiful places on Vancouver Island. So one would have to be Pacific Rim Park, where Long Beach or Chesterman beaches are. Some of those beaches there to me are some of the most beautiful places on Vancouver Island. The second place would be Elk River Valley, and specifically Foster Lake at the base of Mount Colonel Foster, which is about a 14, 16K hike from the road between Camel River and Gold River, which is where the trailhead is. That valley is probably one of the prettiest places on the whole island, inland from the ocean. And so there's a mountain there called Mount Colonel Foster at the end of this valley that is one of the tougher rock climbing mountains to alpine climb on the island. And myself and Adam Creek, who you obviously know well, we've attempted it twice. We've just never respected the amount of time that we needed to allow to get up it. But all the other mountains that we've summited along the way, we haven't been able to get quite to the peak of this one after the two attempts. So this time we're going to go back for our third attempt and give it more than enough time to do it properly. And so that's on the plan for this year, but probably a little bit less on the agenda this year than in prior years, just with some other pursuits that are going on. But I have a few mountains that I want to spread over the next number of years, and maybe in say 10 years, I've got some of the bigger ones in Pakistan and Nepal that I want to go after as well. So that's kind of a lead up at a gradual pace towards those bigger ones.
What's the biggest one you want to check off your list? Like if you knew you could only, you have one, like the big goal. Have you got one?
Well, there's the big ones in the Himalayas, like the top three in the world are pretty enticing. And obviously the number two mountain is in Pakistan. But I kind of got this rational approach to the risks associated, because there is a meaningfully high statistical probability of death. And so on one hand, I think, okay, there's a way of doing these things safely, and probably the technology is improving so that chance goes down. But I also think maybe if I push some of those higher risk mountains out later in life, when, maybe, the dependents and all that kind of stuff are taken care of, then I won't feel so embarrassed about even rationally taking that risk if there is still a risk of some amount. So I'm kind of looking at that, and there's lots of mountains that are obviously lower altitude and much safer to climb, that are just as very enjoyable and great to get to the summit of. So I'll do those for a while, and then maybe as I get older, I'll get to the point where I'm comfortable enough with that risk to look at some of those bigger ones.
Yeah, I found my tolerance for risk is definitely dipped through this part of my life with kids and stuff, but it may return. I think I was, through my teens, early 20s, I was all into all kinds of stuff that's definitely was risky. Now I'm in a bit of a lull. Who knows? Maybe I'll come out the backside and join you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's so much of life that is uncertain. We just can't know the future, and there's a lot of things that we can actually measure the risk in. But if we eliminate all risk, then there's not a lot left that you can actually do, and from an opportunity standpoint, whether it's with work or with just living your life. So the question is not so much can we eliminate all risk, is what amount of risk do we have to actually put into our lives to get the enjoyment out of it, to take advantage of the opportunities. And that's a tougher challenge. Obviously, everybody has their own benchmark that they're willing to accept on that. So anyway, with mountains, there is certainly a consideration there for sure.
I think that's just such a awesome spot to end. Like that last couple sentences you delivered there were just such a great sort of life thing. I think we should just wrap it up there. That was
Sounds
great.
good. Well, thanks for inviting me out. It's always enjoyable to delve into the scientific human sports improvement world that you know so well, and I always like hearing some of your ideas.
For sure. Well, thanks for coming on. We'd definitely get you back on here if and when you've summited your nemesis on Vancouver Island here. I'd love to hear about it.
Sounds good. All right.
Yeah.
Well, have a great rest of the week.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam.
Okay.
Okay. See ya.
See ya. Bye for now.